So first of all, thank you all and welcome to actually the first event of the GDI's People on the Move initiative. This is a webinar that's going to cover our brief on ending the economic exclusion of people on the move, but also feature the panelists you see here on the screen. So I'm excited to talk to you all. We're recording this, so we'll also be able to distribute it to folks who are not able to make it now. We actually spoke to people in almost every time zone for this work. And so there's a lot of people that probably are still sleeping at the moment who we spoke to. So let me introduce the folks you see here, and then I'll tell you the agenda. The panel part of the discussion will be towards the second portion of the call. So we have from Labor Mobility Partnerships, Salvatore Petronella, and he's the LAMP's policy lead. Labor Mobility Partnerships works on creating significantly more opportunities for safe and legal labor mobility across borders for workers from low-income countries to access quality jobs in high-income countries, targeting 500 million people over the next 30 years. We have Stella from Malengo, and Malengo is an organization that facilitates international educational migration at scale by offering finance and mentoring to students from low-income countries who want to complete a university degree in a high-income country. We have Tim, founder of the Refugee Investment Network, which is the first impact investing and blended finance collaborative dedicated to creating long-term solutions to global forced migration. And they're behind a number of other initiatives that you may have heard of, but they work a lot in refugee lens investing, which is a concept they've been introducing to the world. And then lastly, Marina Brizar from Talent Beyond Boundaries. Marina's been traveling, so we're not sure yet whether she'll make it, but Talent Beyond Boundaries unlocks skilled migration for refugees. And they're building a world where displaced people can safely migrate for work, using their skills to rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. So that's the folks that are going to be talking. Let's look at the agenda. The way this will work is I'm going to go through the work of the People on the Move team with the motivation behind that work and our vision for what we think is an emerging field. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time in the panel. So you'll see all those folks I just introduced towards the second half of the call, but that will make up the bulk of our conversation today. And then before we head out, I'll tell you the next steps for what the People on the Move team is up to. And as I mentioned, this is really the beginning for us. And so we're excited to have many of you here at the outset of the journey. So the Global Development Incubator, for those of you who don't know, we design, build, scale transformative social ventures. We have 27 active initiatives right now. We've done over 70 since we started, and with offices out of Hong Kong, India, Kenya, and the US. And I want to illustrate how People on the Move came to be by talking through some of the insights that came out of initiatives that we worked with over the past few years. So these are 6 initiatives in different areas, and for each one of them, there's an insight that shapes the way we think. This is not necessarily the central insight of these organizations. Sometimes it is, but it's an insight that came out of that work that shaped the way we're thinking at People on the Move. So I spent a lot of time working with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. I've been a director at GDI for the past 7 or 8 years. And one of the things that came out to me when you actually start talking to people who have experienced trafficking or forced labor, and you hear their stories, almost every story starts with someone getting an offer of a job or maybe education away from home. Sometimes it's in it may be in the capital city, but a lot of times it's also across borders. So just keeping that in mind. Another insight that I worked with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, and one of the things that I noticed there is that sometimes self-reliance work can hit serious limitations when 70% of displaced people are restricted from legal work. I've been working with Labor Mobility Partnerships for a number of years now, and what's been really interesting coming out of that work is that we're seeing that when labor shortages really start to bite, even very closed societies begin to open their doors. And you could look at, for example, the number of work visas that Japan is creating as just one example of that. With Malengo, what's been really interesting to see is that there's actually already a lot of opportunities for educational mobility, and the only missing ingredient there was finance. With the Migrant Resilience Collaborative, which is based in India and focused on internal migration, one of the things that we saw is that even migrating across state lines can make migrants highly vulnerable to unethical facilitators. So the problems with responsible recruitment and ethical recruitment that I've been working around globally are also present when you have large-scale internal migration. And then lastly, the Refugee Investment Network, one of the main points that they've illustrated is that there's a lot of private capital that has been sitting on the sidelines that could really benefit people on the move if it was channeled in the right way. So having had a chance to kind of look at these initiatives that are targeting trafficking victims, forced people that are forced displaced people, refugees or asylum seekers, and migrants for labor or education, caused us to think that maybe there's something bigger that might be emerging, and maybe a role for GDI to play at kind of a meta or a higher level. So the first step that we took to respond to this, what we thought might be an emerging opportunity, was to do a global landscaping. We went around the world and are continuing a lot of that work. But over the last year or so, we've spoken to 300 people, 130 organizations or agencies, businesses, nonprofits, civil society organizations, and well over 100 people with lived experience. One of the things that was very important to us as we set about this work was making sure that we represent the voices of people on the move themselves. So that was a critical component of our work. And coming out of that landscaping is the emergence of this initiative that we're calling People on the Move. I will note that, we can go to the next slide. Let's do that. Yeah. So this is a teaser, actually. What People on the Move is going to be doing over the next, let's say, few months. We're going to be issuing a number of briefs and having additional convenings. Some of them are going to be more topical. This one is broad enough to cover kind of the whole vision. Some of the next ones will be more focused. One of the more focused briefs will cover a human needs framework for thinking about people on the move, which is depicted here. I won't spend as much time today on that because we'll have a chance to dig deep on it. But I think the main point that I want to make now is that in the space, a lot of times thinking can be limited by thinking about people only in terms of their population categories. So asylum seeker or refugee or displaced person or economic migrant or labor migrant or trafficking victim or irregular migrant. And I think that putting people in these categories, there are sometimes use for it, although many of the categories were made up after World War II in a world that no longer exists today. But it can obscure the fact that there's a commonality of human needs across all people on the move. And so we looked at these choice, voice, inclusion, dignity, capabilities as needs that were common across people on the move and that could ultimately organize some of the work that we think needs to be done. But I will have to leave you there and invite you to come to our deeper dive on this later. So another point and a thing that we have been trying to communicate and also, finding is that sometimes when you're working in the space of migration or people on the move, I've gotten the reaction that like, oh, this is such a niche topic. But what is really clear is actually this is not niche at all. We're talking about over 1 billion people that have either already moved across borders, which is 300 million, or would do so if they could. So at least 900 million have expressed the desire to move across borders. And you could say, well, oh, they're just saying that, but there's a lot of forces that are going to continue to drive that type of movement in the future. So if you add internal migrants, you get to 2 billion people, almost 1 in 5 people in the world is part of this work. One of the things that I think has been underappreciated is this middle category of people that want to move across borders who are unable to, because they typically represent some of the most vulnerable people in the world, the people that a lot of our other anti-poverty programs are attempting to help. So the problem here is not as you may have heard or you may have seen, often migration is itself shaped as like a problem to solve. We really don't see that as the issue. The real issue is that there's cross-border economic exclusion. So, and we're defining that as lack of access to safe and legal economic participation. And what we've seen is there's just a massive upside for ending this. So when you hear us say ending the economic exclusion of people on the move, this is what we're talking about. And this is what you'll see the brief many of you have seen, and the theory of change that I'll go through shortly is really thinking about these concepts. So on the left side, 60% of global income inequality is determined by where you live, i.e., you're born somewhere, and that's 60%. You can look, the other 40% is all the other things that you could think of, whether it's education levels, race, every other determinant, but really where you live is the number one determinant of income inequality. So the challenge is that people from low and middle income countries have been effectively banned from working in high income countries. And if you think of like the subset of refugees, currently 70% live in a place that have restricted or no right to work. Roughly, although the calculations change each year, but roughly 0.5% of refugees are resettled in a year. And without legal options to work, what you see is what I saw when working on modern slavery is that people take desperate routes, whether that means crossing the Mediterranean in a boat or going with a risky middleman to a domestic worker job in a country with very little protection for rule of law. And the result is really high risks of abuse. On the other hand, the opportunity for ending economic exclusion for people on the move is massive income gains. So the income gains from enabling people to take jobs in high income countries totally dwarf the impact of aid programs. You're looking at 10x incomes is not uncommon. Trillions of dollars, and that's right, it's not billions, it's trillions in global economic gains, actually tens of trillions if you were to really end economic exclusion. And that goes to both the receiving countries and the origin countries through trade, investment, and remittances. Employment of vulnerable youth, which is increasingly the number one priority for a number of countries where you have a demographic boom happening right now. But employment of vulnerable youth is critical, but it's also critical because in unstable regions, it helps prevent future conflicts. So addressing people's inability to participate economically across borders also prevents future displacement by addressing some of the root causes of future conflict. And then lastly, if you care about the developed world, solving critical labor shortages is really important actually to ensure service provision in sectors like elderly care, hospitality, etc. What's interesting and what we've come to see is that the very demographic forces that are driving people on the move and that we think will make that 900 million figure closer and closer to a reality in the coming years are also the ones that create an unprecedented opportunity to change the status quo. So what you see here are two population pyramids, although the aging of OECD countries has gotten to such an extent that you can't really even call it a pyramid anymore. It looks to me a little bit like maybe a spinning top or something like that, a Pope hat perhaps. But what you have on the left side actually is, I guess I'll do what I did on the last time I presented this, which is if you can guess the country on the left and the country on the right, you get extra people on the move points. But you have a typical rich country, and on the right side, you have a typical poor country. And you'll see that the youth population perfectly fits the gap in youth in the rich country. And what that translates to is that if we don't add 400 million more workers into OECD countries over the next 30 years, we won't even be able to keep our current ratios of elderly to young people intact, which means that already the kind of precarious systems we have, where there's strong labor shortages and lack of services for the elderly, just even to maintain the status quo, we need 400 million more workers that don't exist. Like, they're not going to come from OECD countries. And on the other side, 500 million more youth are entering the workforce than the number of jobs that are being created in low and middle income countries over that same period. So, for example, right now in sub-Saharan Africa, 12 million youth enter the workforce every year, and only 3 million formal jobs are created, even though there's a lot of really great and exciting economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa. I spent many years in Kenya I'm very optimistic about the growth prospects for sub-Saharan Africa, but the number of people being added to the workforce is just way too many for any amount of economic growth to absorb. So when we put all this together, the observations, where the opportunities are and what needs to be done, we see that there's an emerging field, and there needs to be an emerging field to address this economic exclusion. And basically, our vision is a world where people can move without facing systematic economic exclusion. And I'll spend a little bit of time just going through these parts of the theory of change here for the field. The organizations on this call, on the panel, fit in a number of these different impact pathways. And we've actually compiled a database of about 50 to 60 additional organizations that are doing work in this space, but many of them are still nascent. And we think it's important to describe kind of how the efforts fit together and ultimately to stand up and resource this field. So as I said, the vision is that people can move without facing systematic economic exclusion. We think there's three really critical elements of that. Firstly, that people themselves are prepared to create shared value away from home. So that means that they are getting the training and the skill recognition they need, access to financial services, basically that they have the tools to make a difference and also to be able to improve their own livelihood outside of their home country. And you could think of that as being prepared in advance of a migration experience, or you could think of that as being prepared after being displaced. In both cases, this is a critical element to economic inclusion. And as you can see there, we have skill recognition and access to finance as the two impact pathways for this. I'm actually going to think about adding housing, maybe underneath of financial services when we do the next iteration of that, because increasingly affordable housing is critical to realize some of the benefits of legal movement and employment. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is that ethical actors are safely and transparently facilitating movement and employment. What you'll find, and what we found to date, in much of the world has been a prohibition world when it comes to economic exclusion for people on the move. And when you have a prohibition world, you end up with Al Capones. And so what you have seen in the ethical or in the recruitment space is that there haven't been a lot of ethical actors. It's been dominated by actors acting outside of the rule of law. As we create more safe and legal channels, there needs to be a responsible ethical industry that's facilitating movement and employment. There are things that can be done and in terms of technology platforms that can reduce the need for intermediation or reduce the need for facilitators. But ultimately, when someone moves from one country to another and to get a job, it's not typically going to be a direct transaction between a worker and an employer. And so that's why you need better cross-border livelihood search and matching. And you also need responsible recruitment and employment, which means you need a good industry that outcompetes the bad industry. And there's a real critical need for investment in that. And then the third pillar is governments implementing policies that are conducive to legal movement and employment. And this is often obvious to many people when you first start talking about this topic. A lot of people think that there's nothing that can be done at all because current, immigration law, refugee policy, et cetera, is immovable. What we've seen, and will, I think, hopefully be illustrated on the panel, is that there are opportunities for movement. There have already been a lot, but we think there's actually more to be done, obviously, both in terms of changing labor and migration policies, but also in effective implementation, because sometimes, and actually in a lot of cases, there's some really good policy, but it's not really translating to the ground. We spent a lot of time in Uganda for this work, and it has really impressive on paper policies with regard to refugees' right to work, but a lot of times actually accessing work permits is not so easy for refugees based in Uganda. So there's a whole element around implementation that's needed. Before I go to the next slide, I'll just note that to get a sense of kind of where some of the people on this call are fitting, labor mobility partnerships is really working across. Go back to the theory of change. So labor mobility partnerships here is really working across many of these buckets, but migration and labor policy change, effective policy implementation, responsible recruitment and employment are particularly part of their work. But they are also working on training and skill recognition with language instruction, for example. Malengo and Talent Beyond Boundaries, a lot of their work is probably fitting in this cross-border livelihood search and matching. Malengo for educational purposes, Talent Beyond Boundaries, obviously for work. But that also links then, at least with Talent Beyond Boundaries, they're also working on policy change and implementation. Refugee Investment Network does a lot with that would fit into the access to financial services bucket. So creating financial solutions and bringing the investment needed for refugees, as well as policy change through its Refugee Opportunity Index. Responsible recruitment and employment is an area that really needs impact investment, so could be potentially linked. And then so that's where some of the folks here fit. There are other organizations, they may fit into just one pathway, but I think a lot of the work is going to span across these pathways. Now we can, So as I said, we've mapped a number of initiatives to the theory of change. These are just some of the pictures of the work that's happening right now. People being trained, people being sent, there's greater advocacy, narrative change happening. But there's really not a lot of resources to seize the opportunities that exist at scale. So go to the next slide. Relative to the potential impact that we're talking about, economic inclusion for people on the move, in my opinion, I haven't yet seen anything else that would challenge this, but I think it's basically one of the world's most neglected funding areas, if not the most neglected funding area. So it would be good. I haven't seen one that's more neglected than this. I'm happy to hear otherwise. But when you're talking about trillions of dollars in economic gains, you would think that the aid community and philanthropy would be investing in making this a reality. But in reality, only 0.4% of ODA and 0.5% of private philanthropy is going to anything that's kind of close to economic inclusion for people on the move. And that's, for example, private philanthropy, that's basically $60 million a year. ODA, less than $1 billion a year. Almost no donor is citing labor or educational mobility as a funding category at all. And many of the grants that have been made for people on the move have typically been focused on deterrence rather than actually providing economic opportunities for people on the move. So what we're trying to do, and this is a real focus for us going forward, is trying to mobilize flexible funding to catalyze larger aid flows and impact investments. We think that this mismatch in funding it's just resulting in a massive missed opportunity and misallocation of capital. But we also understand that it's hard to shift major bilateral and aid players or large foundations, as well as even investors, if you can't demonstrate first maybe what's possible. So we're looking at bringing funders together. We're talking about raising a collaborative fund to basically demonstrate how to fund work in this area. And one of the next things we do will be a closed door session with funders to discuss this further and figure out what's possible. But you'll see this dark blue boxes here. The need for innovation grants to design and scale new solutions, the need for flexible funding can really, we think, catalyze additional funding into these 6 pathways of impact that we've highlighted here. So that's what we're up to. That's where we think a huge need is. And I'm going to then pivot now to the panel. Okay. So I think I will start with, okay, good. It looks like we have everyone here, so that's wonderful. I will start with LAMP, and I think what I'll do, we'll see, we have about 5 to 10 minutes each. As I've introduced you so far, but if you want to add anything more about your organization as we go, you can do that. But once we, I'll do about 2 questions each, and then we'll go from there. As people have been noting in the comments, we're happy to take more questions through the chat feature. We'll see if we have a chance to answer those. If not, we might need to do those after after the conversation. But so first, Salvatore from LAMP, as I mentioned, there's a lot of times when I talk about our work, especially people in the US and the UK will say, you know, how is it possible to really do anything about these issues given the political toxicity around immigration? And I actually think there is opportunity in the US and the UK, but I think most people would be more optimistic if they looked outside of those two countries. And what I tell people is that the policy landscape is changing. And I want to know if you could talk to us a little bit about how policies have created opportunities, at least on paper, for labor mobility in places like Europe. And then if you could then explain, why don't we see these pathways being fully utilized if the opportunities are there, and what has to happen to get to scale, and tell us about LAMP's work in that area.
Sure. Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for this opportunity to have LAMP at this meeting, and congratulations on the work of POTM, which I found very interesting, and I think can shed a lot of light on what needs to be done in a collective spirit with all the stakeholders involved. You're right. I mean, the narrative around labor mobility seems to be a bit discouraging or negative or not inspiring, I would say. But on paper, at least, a lot of movements are happening in the policy agenda of member states, even if they don't hit the headlines, let's say, of newspapers or blogs or social media. The landscape is evolving. The government are being more intentional in reflecting the importance of labor mobility in the policy agendas. And maybe just to be concrete, because I think then people get their head around some concrete examples, I can just list a number of countries and policy shifts we have witnessed in Europe so far. And of course, Europe as destination continent, but of course having the other side in different continents globally. So if you take the example of Spain with a recent labor reform launched last year and still ongoing, and the expansion of labor mobility pathways to Latin America, and the consolidation in countries like Morocco and Senegal. Germany is famous, of course, for the pilots in different sectors in different countries. Nevertheless, they keep expanding. And the example is, for instance, on seasonal work and agreements with Georgia. Portugal is very intentional lately with concrete agreement with India, Morocco, and all the Portuguese-speaking countries. Even Italy, you know, despite the shift to a more conservative approach to migration, still they're expanding the list of third country eligible under the quota system to Central America. Even the Czech Republic is opening to Central Asia, Greece to Egypt, or India is the new target country for many European member states, including Cyprus and Finland. So what this shows is a concrete interest of EU countries or European countries, if we add the UK or Switzerland or Norway, actually, to secure more mobility. What happens is they put the right relevance, although in an unbalanced, power play, I would say, with sending countries. On the other hand, we see also the sending country side becoming more and more vocal on the need to open up labor pathways, either through the governments or either through the embassy representatives. And I mentioned the case of Georgia, but also if we look in Latin America, the role done by Peru or Chile lately, or even the role of Vietnam in advocating for more and more labor pathways, it's clear. Next to this, we see also an evolution on the concrete side, on the practical side. Pilot projects exist, nevertheless, they're hard to scale, and I'm going to explain a bit why I think so. They have not evolved lately, further than, let's say, the 2 digits or the 3 digits limits in terms of outcomes, in terms of mobility, concrete mobility of workers. So the question that we are reflecting on at LAMP, basically, it's how can we turn those policies into regulated pathways for decent work, and how also can we help governments and private sector to scale them up. So now moving basically to your second question, we think that the intention are there, the relevance are explained by economic or social arguments, socioeconomic arguments. We think that there's a level of support also from a different organization at EU level, for instance. There's a need and there's a push to further coordinate on those policies. and to bring them into long-term sustainable responses. However, the EU itself as an institution doesn't have competences in this field, which remains very much in the national hands. So what we see as a first step, I would say necessary but not sufficient, is, for instance, the multiplication of bilateral labor agreements. On paper, they have basically all the elements that you would foresee for having a decent mobility scheme between countries, you know, the elements of ethical recruitment, respect of the dignity of life, family reunification, rights for workers, and so forth. But the concrete question is that how they translate into practical avenues. And that's where governments, either they don't have the capacities to do that, or they don't have the understanding of how to do it, or they don't have the wish to take the risk to do that. So one way to do that, and we see that, for instance, some countries which I would highlight as forerunners, or anyway interesting examples, is what happens, for instance, in Spain. A stronger coordination between authorities, revising, let's say, the occupational list for mobility, engaging discussion with a wider number of sending countries, and also looking at pathways from a sector-oriented perspective. So no global general quotas, but more targeted quotas or targeted agreements, which really look at the economic needs and the skill that can be provided from the sending country side. We know the sectors in Europe, you know, seasonal workers, constructions, hospitality, long-term care, road transport, and so forth. Those are the main ones which will see more and more a competition between countries, I think, in the future. So what member states and countries in Europe and more globally will have to do is, first of all, try to translate those agreements into practice, but also try to embed them in a longer-term vision of national policies. In this sense, I think that the role of LAMP is really accompanying governments in try to elevate those practices once they're tested and when they become trustworthy, and once they can be replicated, elevate them into policies which can then help governments to scale up and to increase the number of mobilities. The data that you've shown are there. We just have to put this into practice. So the role of LAMP in this is really to intervene to, first of all, single out, I would say, the bottlenecks, the hurdles which hamper or prevent mobility globally, fix them in an incentive-based spirit. What I mean there is looking at the incentives for all the parties involved: government, migrant workers, companies, private sector, civil society, even hosting and sending societies. And then increase the potential by identifying technical or financial solution which can be replicated and adapted to different contexts. So what we try to think is, we call it innovative, but probably to the migration world, it will be almost a bit unconventional way to seek for opportunities to move migrants across borders, migrant workers across borders. So in that sense, I think we can play a unique role, but of course, very much complementary to all what's happening. When I say complementary, it's also complementary to the policies that member states and countries have to implement. For instance, one of the elements that we often debate on is labor mobility the solution alone? No, we don't think so. Of course, there are other measures which can increase the employability to unemployed people locally, or regularization practices in some countries are also seen as an alternative. But the potential of regulated labor mobility has much more, can have much more impact in terms of economic gains for the destination society, but also for the sending society. I will stop there probably. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and I think that what's been interesting in my observation of LAMP is this idea that you mentioned of starting with practice and then moving to policy. And I think that historically, the people think like, let's just get a policy in place and then it'll all trickle down. And what LAMP tries to do is demonstrate how a mobility program could work in practice, and then from that be able to increase the implementation of policies and change policies. I want to pivot to Marina at Talent Beyond Boundaries and just get your thoughts. In particular, how do you see the link between your work, which involves sending matchmaking and getting workers from who are refugees to employers, but you're also working in the policy space. How do you see, where do you think there's the most bang for the buck in your work? What kind of policy changes are you excited about on the horizon? And then I wonder if you can also talk about this question that I've been talking about with regard to the underfunded nature of the space. Why should funders who care about displaced people, because there's a decent amount of funding in the refugee world, but why should those funders be thinking about talent mobility as a solution to the millions of refugees that are waiting in exile?
Thanks so much, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm in London, so good morning, I should say, to North America. I might start with your first question. So just by way of introduction, I'm the UK and Europe Director of Talent Beyond Boundaries. In terms of why should funders care, I think that it is because initiatives to do with complementary pathways and labour mobility, specifically for refugees, falls within a few crevices. It falls within the crevice of resettlement and vulnerable sort of movement of people on the basis of vulnerability, as it should, and that needs to remain sanctified and everything else. And then on the other side, you've got development in terms of capacity building, and then you've got some really unlikely players. And the thing is that governments, big organizations, global organizations, corporate sector, all believe that someone else has a role in funding this movement. And very often it's about being creative about how you seek funding, but then that sort of limits your scope and your restrictive way in which you are funded, which then limits the ability to be innovative and creative and actually deliver on what the mandate is. And that is to make labour mobility, international recruitment and movement accessible for people who are forcibly displaced. So I think that funders and philanthropists have a real opportunity to be able to be the bridge to really elevate this as a movement so that we can be sustainable, to Salvador's point, to go beyond, government funded projects here and there because it's sort of the flavour of the year. So that's to the first point. To the second point around bang for the buck. Talent Beyond Boundaries is a really action-oriented organisation. So we believe in actually doing the work to understand the barriers, which then inform our policy decision-making and our policy strategies. And so what we really do is we ask that employers and candidates effectively become pioneers. We ask them to become pioneers, to say, we are testing this out. We are trying to bring you through a normal, standard skilled migration program, and together with you work out what integration needs are, what challenges are, and how we can actually enhance policy spaces. Which is challenging. There is policy around rhetoric that needs to be changed, but then there's also policy within global organizations who actually hire, recruitment policies, mobility policies that don't take into account the vulnerability of displaced people. But what we can't deny is that there is a supply and demand issue here, right? So there is a demand for skilled talent and there is a demand for skills globally. I mean, 2023 for the European Commission is the year of skills, right? We know that there are over 103 forcibly displaced people around the world, 103 million, I should say, forcibly displaced people around the world, and at least half of those are of working age. So as soon as there is a recognition that refugees should not be excluded from this as a pool of talent, an untapped pool of talent, it allows us to then elevate these discussions around policies. So in terms of what that looks like for TBB and where we're really excited, I can speak to mostly the UK and Europe examples. So in the UK, we have a pilot, and the idea really is to make that a permanent pilot, to create a world-first hybrid visa for forcibly displaced people to be able to access skilled work visa pathways, international work opportunities, but then be supported on the basis of their displacement. So that includes policy changes around providing evidence to get access to those visas, but also what support those candidates receive once they arrive in country. Given means, given perhaps lack of network, given perhaps lack of language ability, especially for family members. So really creating a holistic sort of space in this grey area between skilled and humanitarian. So that's sort of where we're at in the UK. We've had some really strong policy wins. For example, we've developed a pathway for nurses where they can enter the UK as healthcare assistants and within 6 to 12 months become registered nurses because of flexibility of the Nursing Midwifery Council. So the NMC have actually Belgium's looking, and so the UK is informing Belgium. So this transnational best practice on what displaced sort of policies could look like in different countries. From a European perspective, we are part of a consortium opening pathways in Portugal, Belgium and Ireland. And so we're looking at opening our labour mobility pathways in all those countries. We actually have got pilots in all those countries and we're starting with recruitment. So again, really excited about that. Another interesting development and something that's really sort of empowering is that the European Commission has released their next phase of AMIF, so the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, and there is a specific topic on labour mobility for refugees. So there is starting to be more and more attention on this, but I will say that is for a budget that has been the same for the last 5 years and doesn't take into account inflation or anything else. So it's becoming more and more sort of challenging to fit within the confines of these certain funds, which goes to the first point. Finally, I will say that there is a real openness to think about talent as talent and to start to remove the labels. So very recently, TBB was asked to provide some evidence around the development of the EU talent pool and thinking about from the outset, how does the EU talent pool avoid distinctions and challenges in terms of refugee access to the EU talent pool for non-member state actors trying to get into the European labour market. A final thing that I'll say, and I think that this goes to, again, the point of sustainability. The hardest policy, it's not a policy, the hardest aspect in all of this to change is rhetoric, right? So there's rhetoric within governments to say, to very quickly try and label this safe and legal routes. This is the good refugee versus the bad refugee and all those sort of things. So managing that messaging within governments is really challenging. So to alluded to the Italian government and reducing migration, but still the Italian government support humanitarian corridors. So that messaging and that rhetoric is a gentle dance with governments. But then you've got this rhetoric with companies, right? Where you say, we have the talent catalogue, we have over 63,000 professionals registered, ranging from archaeologists to butchers, from management consultants to software engineers. And one of the biggest challenges is to say there is a refugee looking for a job and people's mind immediately goes to someone sitting in a desert in a tent. Mm-hmm. There is no real acknowledgement that there is education and skilled people, that you are a skilled professional before you are a refugee. So I'll just end on that note because I have lived experience as a refugee. So I was born in Bosnia. I grew up in a refugee camp with my family. I moved to Australia through the humanitarian program. My dad was an engineer. My mum was an economist. Within 6 months of arriving, on the basis our vulnerability, my dad got a job at Vodafone, and he was like, God, if only I got a job, we would have avoided a siege, and we would have avoided living through a refugee camp and pausing our lives for 6 years. And so that's the real sort of rhetoric change that needs to happen with governments, with civil society, and with organizations. And there is no funding that helps with things like those comms and the slow burn towards sustainability. So thanks.
Good point, and probably a good transition to Tim at the Refugee Investment Network, because I know that a lot of your work has been about reframing. And I think for the sake of time, I'm going to have to give you a let's try to do it maybe in 4 or 5 minutes. But what are your thoughts on kind of on how the Refugee Investment Network thinks about this question about reframing the rhetoric and I know some of your work touches on the opportunity index, refugee opportunity index. Could you just talk about how you think about changing narratives and changing policies? And then if you have time, a little bit about where you see the role of investment in inclusion.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, fellow panelists. It's great to be included with such awesome organizations that you represent. So thanks for including Rin. Just real quickly, I just want to say, I want to acknowledge Joanne K. Edelman, who's Rin's great chief operating officer, who's on this call and has been with our project since the beginning 5 years ago. Rin's theory of change is really based on 5 pillars, and it goes to your question, Jason. We want to, in the first instance, build the field of refugee lens investing, okay? Second pillar is mobilizing capital through that lens of impact investing. Third pillar is narrative change, to get more to your question. And the fourth pillar is policy change. Everything that Rin does rolls up under one of these pillars. All of our initiatives, our complete toolbox of methodologies that we present to interested capital partners speaks to one of those 4 pillars. More directly to your question, with regards to policy change, this was something that we thought we needed to be most creative about. And so we enlisted the Economist Intelligence Unit a few years ago. And I'll just I won't speak too much about it, but I'll throw a link into the chat here. And if you all have time, you can do a deeper dive into what our ROI, Refugee Opportunity Index, is all about there. The ROI, of course, is that double entendre, right? Return on investment, Refugee Opportunity Index. But the idea there being that if we can take a look at countries' policies, and we look at 3 buckets, broad buckets of policies: admissions, integration, and resettlement policies. The second bucket, we look at our basic rights and access to services. And the third policy bucket is employment conditions, very important to the work that we do. We had a panel of experts come up with 45 indices, and we go through, as you'll see if you look at that link, and evaluate, interrogate those policies with the hopes, Jason, of really informing policymakers to where the gaps exist, shining a bright light on those gaps. And we don't do this to sort of name or blame and shame anybody, but we try to create actionable and relevant data points for donors and policymakers to revisit and see if we can find weaknesses, like you pointed out in Uganda, with the time it takes to get, for example, a worker's permit. Our index would indicate that. The second goal of the ROI is to inform private sector stakeholders, investors in particular, about opportunities and constraints faced by refugees, with the aim of incentivizing investments in refugee value chains and refugee supporting entrepreneurs, et cetera. And then thirdly, I think the goal of the ROI is really to create a demonstration effect. We can see in black and white where a country sort of stacks up with regards to their policy. And we've seen in other examples, Millennium Challenge Corporation has created, it's a development agency based in the United States where I was formerly employed, creates these scorecards, snapshots, if you will, which are really useful to incentivize others who are interested in these things. Just real quickly on the capital front, we try to use data that show that people who have been forcibly displaced empirically are more entrepreneurial, they're better debtors, they're better renters, they're hard workers, they're more loyal often, and there's less churn if you hire these folks. We try to use those data to show that, and getting to our narrative change piece, displaced people shouldn't be viewed as a burden. They should be looked at as an opportunity. And we're trying to create that narrative, Jason, and incentivize impact investors along those lines. So I'll stop there. I've used my 5 minutes.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And that's hopefully a lot of these thoughts are sort of appetizers for people to dig deeper, because I think it's really interesting the work you're doing. And that's only just as we know, a part of a much broader set of efforts that Rin is doing. I want to turn to Stella. So Stella is the head of the Uganda office for Malengo. And what's exciting about, well, in the last few weeks at Malengo, we've now gone into our third cohort of students. It's 120 students. I think the first one was 7, the second was like 25. And so the growth is happening at a pretty good pace. And these are students going from Uganda into Germany to study, facilitated by an income share agreement. And the plan for Malengo is to continue scaling exponentially and really reach hundreds of thousands of students in a way that you couldn't do with a scholarship program. I wonder, Stella, if you could talk a little bit, just since you're on the ground in Uganda with students, do you, two things, when you talk to students and their parents who are looking, how do they think about the cost in terms of, this is entering into a financial obligation, but at the same time, and it also means, going to a whole other part of the world, not necessarily knowing the language, et cetera, versus the benefits. And how does this affect the way they think about their studies? I don't know if you've gotten any early data yet in terms of, does the opportunity to study in university in Germany change the way students think about their studies back home?
Yes, I missed a bit of you. I think
Sure.
My network wasn't good at the beginning, but I think I got the point.
Okay.
Something to do with considering how the parents, how they view the students view the ISA, and about the opportunity to study in German and how it impacts on them.
Yeah.
Okay. Generally, maybe looking at the students that before they have transitioned to German, and in relation to the ISA, they are very excited about the opportunity that the ISA gives them. They look at it as something that is, I would say, God-given. More of where else would they get this chance? Where would they get this funding that the ISA is giving them? A great opportunity to get out of the country. There's a belief that once one goes out of the country, one cannot fail to succeed in life. And it's like they have achieved a very big goal, a solution to all problems they would have encountered in the future. This gives them an opportunity to quality education in Germany. They can compete internationally for jobs, and even back at home, when they come back, they can get high caliber jobs. At this point, they had to look at the costs or concerns. The excitement about getting this great opportunity outweighs any challenges or concerns. Mm-hmm. At this point, the concern that they really bring out is, what can stop me from going to Germany? Mm-hmm. What will be the limitations for me to get this great opportunity? So you find that they will not be looking at the ISA. The ISA for them is everything. What they'll be looking at right now is, how can I go to Germany? They're looking at what are the requirements? They're looking at the TOEFL test. How will I be able to pass this TOEFL test? Is it going to stop me from going to German? They're looking at when I go to German, will I get accommodation? What do I really have to do to go to German? So at this point, the issue is not the ISA. The issue is how do I get to German? I think if we are to look at it on the other side as how does the ISA impact on them? I think it would make more sense to look at the ones who are currently there.
Right.
So these ones who haven't yet gone, the ISA is nothing, because for them at the bottom line is that once I've gone out of the country, I've got everything.
Yeah. No, and I think that's why one of the things Malengo has done, as I know, is build in a mentoring program to help people then navigate the next steps once they're there, because it's hard to project. I see we are at time. I'd love to actually talk more, but I think that we probably have to wrap up. Apologies that we cut short a little bit more than I'd like, but I'd love to have a deeper conversation where we can get into kind of the way the way local stakeholders in Uganda are thinking about Malengo. I know it's still in the early days, but it seems like there's been a lot of excitement so far. Let's wrap up here. Let me just quickly say where we're headed next, and invite you to follow along. We're going to be publishing about 3 more briefs, at least in the near horizon. So as I mentioned, kind of a deep dive on the human needs framework, and then a deeper analysis of where the funding flows are currently. And then on the other side, a review of some of the bright spots that we found that can illustrate the pathways in our theory of change. Excuse me, the latter part done with an eye towards how can we fund these types of efforts. And as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at convening a funder table to try to talk about what do we need to elevate the issue to mobilize greater resources, and what are some collaborative funding approaches that we can take. Can we get to something like a flexible pooled fund, or can we get to a donor collaborative? We're exploring what's needed, but really to kind of kickstart more of these efforts in the space. And then can we get to the let's just post the email address. We'd love for you all to stay in touch. This is a way to reach us. And I believe also that Meredith has posted in the chat a link. If you're not on our current newsletter, you can sign up by clicking that link to get updates on our work. Thank you all very much. It's been great to have this time together. And I think we'll need to have more of these types of conversations.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jason.